You wash your hands before dinner. You do not think about why. It is automatic, invisible, almost meaningless. But 600 years ago, that single habit did not exist anywhere on Earth. Nobody knew it mattered. And that gap in knowledge, not a gap in strength or courage or faith, is what let a disease erase a third of a continent. This is the story of the Black Death. And it is also a question: what if the people living through it had known exactly what you know now? Not your machines, not your medicine, just your knowledge. Would it have mattered? Start with what actually happened. In the autumn of 1347, ships arrived in the port of Messina, Sicily, carrying more than cargo. Historian Ole Benedictau has estimated that within 6 years, the disease killed somewhere between 50 and 60% of Europe's entire population. Entire villages went silent. Fields went unharvested because there was no one left standing to harvest them. Nobody understood what was happening. Physicians blamed bad air, called miasma, drifting up from swamps and corpses. Some blamed the alignment of planets. Some blamed sin. Some blamed strangers. And that blame turned lethal for entire communities who had nothing to do with any of it. What they were actually facing was a bacterium, Yersinia pestis. It would not be identified for over 500 years until 1894, when a Swiss physician named Alexander Yersin isolated it during an outbreak in Hong Kong. Yersin discovered what medieval Europe never could. The bacteria traveled inside fleas, the fleas traveled on rats, and the rats traveled on ships, wagons, and the backs of unaware human beings. Now bring your knowledge back to 1347. You know the bacteria exists, even without a microscope to show you. You know it moves through bites, through blood, through breath, through touch. You know contaminated fleas can survive in fabric and grain for weeks. You know isolation breaks transmission chains. You know none of this can be seen, and none of it needs to be seen to be real. But here's the uncomfortable truth of the experiment. Knowledge is not the same as power. You have no antibiotics, no vaccine, no electricity, no laboratory, no telephone to warn the next town before the ships arrive. You have exactly what a 14th century person has: wood, cloth, boats, horses, and other people who may or may not believe a word you say. So what could actually be done? Start with the one intervention medieval society already stumbled toward, almost by accident. In 1377, the maritime city of Ragusa, now Dubrovnik, ordered that arriving ships and travelers from plague-affected areas wait 30 days before entering the city. Later, this was extended to 40, giving us the word quarantine, from the Italian quaranta giorni. Nobody in Ragusa understood bacteria. They understood pattern. Sick places produced sick travelers. Distance and time seemed to break the chain. With modern knowledge, that instinct becomes a science. You would not guess at 30 or 40 days. You would know the incubation period of bubonic plague runs roughly 2 to 6 days, and pneumonic plague can kill within 1 to 3. You could calibrate isolation with precision instead of superstition. You could identify who actually needs to be separated and for how long, instead of quarantining everyone equally and starving half a town in the process. Ports become the next target. Trade ships carried rats before they carried anything else. Close the right ports at the right moment. Inspect incoming grain and cloth for rodent activity. And you cut off one of the disease's favorite highways. This was, in fact, tried. Venice and Milan experimented with travel restrictions during the outbreak. Milan, notably, had some of the lowest mortality rates of any major Italian city, and some historians connect that partly to its unusually aggressive sealing of infected houses. Correlation is not proof, but it is suggestive of something medieval authorities half understood and modern epidemiology could sharpen into a real strategy. Then there is the part almost nobody in the 14th century suspected at all: the fleas themselves. A 2018 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, led by researcher Catherine Dean, modeled plague transmission across multiple historical outbreaks and found that human parasites, specifically human fleas and body lice, likely played a larger role in spreading plague between people than rat fleas alone. That single detail would have changed everything about where you focused your effort. Not just rat control at the docks, clothing, bedding, bodies washed and burned rather than piled. Every layer of fabric touching skin becomes a suspect. Could medieval society act on that? Partially. Boiling water existed. Burning infected bedding existed. Separating a sick household's belongings from a healthy neighbor's was entirely within their technological reach. It did not require a single invention that didn't already exist in 1347. It required only the reason to do it. Ventilation matters too, though for different reasons than they believed. Miasma theory was wrong about causes, but its instinctive prescription, more open air, less crowding, accidentally helped. Pneumonic plague spreads through respiratory droplets in close, poorly ventilated spaces. Open windows, distanced sick rooms, and reduced crowding in the sealed, smoky houses common at the time would have genuinely lowered transmission, even though nobody understood why it worked. Now for hygiene, and here the limitations become sharp. You know that hand washing and clean water reduce secondary infection. But clean water in a medieval town was not a tap. It was a communal well, a river shared with animal waste, or nothing at all. Soap existed but was a luxury good, not a household staple. You could teach the concept in an afternoon. You could not manufacture the infrastructure in a decade. This is the pattern worth noticing. Every intervention splits into two categories: things that require only knowledge and available materials, cloth, fire, distance, timing, which could have been implemented almost immediately, and things that require infrastructure that simply did not exist: clean municipal water, mass sanitation, medical supply chains, which no amount of knowledge could conjure overnight. Now consider the dead, because in 1347, the dead themselves became a transmission problem nobody knew how to solve. Bodies piled in streets and churchyards faster than they could be blessed, let alone buried. Mass graves, later uncovered by archaeologists in London and Barcelona, show bodies stacked in careful rows, evidence that even in chaos, some effort at order survived. With modern knowledge, you would know something the gravediggers of 1347 didn't. A plague corpse is not equally dangerous at every stage. Fleas abandon a cooling body within hours, searching for a warmer host. That means speed matters more than ceremony. Quick, careful burial or burning, handled by designated workers wearing layered cloth wrapped tightly at the wrists and ankles, denying fleas a path onto skin, would have reduced one of the disease's quietest transmission routes. None of that required invention. It required only knowing where the actual danger was hiding. Waste tells a similar story. Medieval towns dumped refuse in streets and rivers, the same rivers used for drinking and washing. You would know enough to separate those two systems immediately. Waste routed away from any water source, even a primitive ditch dug with the tools already in every farmer's shed. It would not create clean water. It would simply stop actively poisoning the water that already existed. And then there is a tool medieval Europe barely used at all: writing things down with purpose. You would know that outbreaks follow patterns. First cases near ports and trade roads spread following human movement rather than divine will. Keeping simple records, who fell ill, when and where they had traveled, turned superstition into evidence. It's how officials in later, better documented outbreaks began identifying infected neighborhoods before the disease had spread across an entire city. In the 14th century, this alone, tracking cases like a hunter tracks a trail, would have given town councils something they never had: a warning, even a small one, instead of a surprise. Then there is the hardest obstacle of all, and it isn't technological. It's political. Imagine standing in front of a 14th century mayor and telling him invisible creatures too small to see are riding on fleas that live on rats that live in his grain stores, and the solution is to burn valuable cloth, seal off trade routes that feed his treasury, and quarantine his own nobility. You would sound insane, possibly heretical. In a century where unexplained knowledge was frequently read as witchcraft or divine punishment, being right could be as dangerous as being wrong. Merchants would resist port closures because closed ports meant ruin. The church, still processing a catastrophe many read as God's punishment for sin, might view aggressive human intervention as an act of defiance rather than mercy. Ordinary people, terrified and grieving, needed an explanation they could act on emotionally, not just epidemiologically. Convincing them may have taken longer than the outbreak itself. You would likely need allies, not just arguments. A single physician, however correct, rarely moved a medieval city council alone. But a physician who could demonstrate results, a household that isolated early and survived while its neighbors did not, a ship inspected and turned away that never brought its sickness ashore, build something more persuasive than any explanation. A pattern people could see with their own eyes, even without understanding the cause behind it. Trust, in 1347, was earned through visible outcomes, not visible microbes. There would also be enormous friction simply feeding people you'd separated. Isolating a household for 2 weeks sounds simple until you ask who brings them food, water, and firewood without becoming infected themselves. Every intervention that protects one group creates a new logistical burden for another. Modern knowledge tells you what to do. It does not tell you how to feed an isolated village when the harvest is already thin and half the farmhands are sick. So, add it up. What actually changes? Historians estimate that later, better documented plague outbreaks in cities that used real quarantine and isolation measures, 17th century London among them, saw mortality patterns shift when authorities enforced separation quickly and consistently. It didn't eliminate the disease. It slowed it, flattened it, gave more people more time. Applied to the 14th century with full modern knowledge but only medieval tools, the honest answer is not that the Black Death disappears. Millions still likely die. Trade still spreads infection faster than any warning system of horses and messengers could outrun. But early, accurate isolation, targeted port controls, fabric and body hygiene aimed specifically at fleas and lice rather than vague miasma. And reduced crowding in sick rooms could plausibly have cut transmission substantially, perhaps reducing the death toll by a meaningful fraction rather than eliminating it. Not a cure, a dampening. The difference between a third of a continent and perhaps a fifth. The final twist is the one worth sitting with. The most powerful tool your hypothetical time traveler carries back to 1347 is not a device. It's not a formula. It is the simple, invisible understanding of cause and effect that disease travels through specific, predictable, interruptible paths rather than punishment or fate. That single shift in understanding, applied imperfectly with primitive tools against enormous resistance, still outperforms every remedy 14th century medicine actually tried. Which brings the question back to you, in your kitchen, at your sink, hands under running water without a second thought. That habit is not nothing. It is the ghost of a lesson that took Europe 500 years and tens of millions of lives to learn the hard way. You know it before you've ever needed it. That is the real weapon, not the technology, the knowing.